Over here, below the medieval keep, well away from the front of the house, we see the 19th century stables. Although we know that the first buildings on this site were constructed by Heron's successors, the Wildman family, it seems almost certain that most, if not all, of what we see today was built by the Hardy family, who followed the Wildmans here in the 1860s. Of course, the main feature of this film is the building here behind me, the house constructed by Dudley Digges between the years 1612 and 1616. He was living at a time when architecture in England was beginning to benefit from the influences of Roman, classical and Italian architecture, which was finding its way across Europe at that time. The house contains a number of features of that growing fashion, but it also has elements of English vernacular architecture which had dominated this country for centuries. If you look at the house, it's more or less symmetrical. You can see the turrets at the corners and the flat windows beside them, the protruding central porch, and on the far side there, the two-story bow window, about which we'll have a great deal more to say later. As you get round the back of the house, you'll see it's a very unusual shape. In fact, it's a hexagon with one side missing. This strange design has for generations been attributed to Inigo Jones, but nowadays most experts seem to discount that idea. It's thought more likely that the house was designed by Dudley Digges himself. His father and his grandfather were well-known mathematicians who published several learned books. These books led their respective fields in mathematics and astronomy for generations after their own time. Leonard Digges, Dudley's grandfather, named the theodolite, and he invented the telescope long before Galileo was around. The unique design of Chilham combines classical fashion, English vernacular architecture, sensitivity to the site, and the mathematics in Sir Dudley's blood. The elevation that you see here today only dates from the 1920s. It was created by Sir Edmund Davis and his architect Sir Herbert Baker. Before that, the Victorians made the building look like this. You can see that the flat windows beside the porch were rather smaller. They only had 2 mullions instead of 3. But on the other hand, the oriel over the front door was rather larger in Victorian days. Here's a photograph of the building as it looked in Georgian days, and you'll see there's no oriel at all. But the windows flanking the porch are larger, much resembling those which we see today. Here's an engraving showing the building before that. This was done in the late 18th century, 1777 to be precise. And that shows the oriel window over the porch as it was originally, or so we believe. And finally, let me show you this drawing which dates from 1741, which you can possibly just make out the porch in the middle of the front elevation, and then flanking it you've got 2 large bow windows on 2 stories which resemble the one that we still see on the front of the house today. This drawing, part of a large picture showing Chilham in its landscape setting, was produced by the Buck brothers, Samuel and Nathaniel, when Chilham was in the hands of James Colebrook the banker. He had purchased the castle and estate from Colonel Thomas Digges, great-grandson of Sir Dudley. The drawing marked the vesting of Chilham in a trust, whose beneficiary was Colebrook's eldest son, Robert, whose first wedding took place that year. Now here we have the side elevation of the house, the southeast side, facing the view and facing the sunshine. This is where the principal private rooms were located. Here, to some extent, Dudley Digges followed the medieval arrangement, tacking these rooms onto one end of the central hall in the front block, to the right of this picture. You will see that we have at the front end of this wing the rounded bow window which resembles those which used to be on the front of the house. This one was inserted in the 1920s. This picture from the Victorian period shows an angular bay in this position, with the side bays that we see today. If you go back to George times, there were no bay windows, no protuberances, just a plain purity of design. All this playing around with windows reduced the light reaching the interior, making the rooms darker. Bay windows let in more light than flat ones, and though the Victorians did replace the bay windows which the Georgians took away from this south wing, they made the windows on the front rather smaller. The front elevation faces north, making the need for daylight even greater. I simply do not understand why the Victorians wanted smaller windows there. Here we are round towards the back, and you can see the bays on the south wing from another angle. You can also see where this wing has been extended, where there is an expanse of plain brick at first floor level. When the Victorians did this, they blocked one of the vistas devised by Sir Dudley Digges when he fixed the shape and the position of the house. We shall come back to that when we look at the gardens in more detail. Round here at the back of the house you may be surprised by its shape. The private wing, which we were examining just now, is on the right. The kitchen wing is on the left. The hall block is in the centre. This layout echoes the medieval house plan which had been familiar in England for centuries. But in this case, the side wings, as you can see, are bent back to form a central courtyard, giving the house a hollow core. The door opening into the central courtyard lines in with the main entrance, following the axis devised by Sir Dudley Digges to run across the forecourt and over the village square to the church beyond, as you can see in this aerial photograph. If there is any other house in England like this, I don't know of it. 400 years ago, when this house was designed, there were, in London, where Sir Dudley was living, several buildings of polygonal shape with hollow cores. Not houses to live in, but playhouses, theatres, where plays written by Shakespeare and Marlowe and others were performed. The Digges family had associations with theatre folk, including William Shakespeare. Sir Dudley's stepfather, Thomas Russell, was overseer to Shakespeare's last will and testament, and Dudley's brother, Leonard, was involved with the publication of Shakespeare's work, but that's not often mentioned these days. On the other hand, there's another great name which has been linked with Chilham for hundreds of years, that of Inigo Jones, whom I mentioned briefly a while ago. Dudley Digges would have known Jones at the royal court, and Jones too had theatrical connections. Before he became England's leading architect, designing and building palaces for the King and Queen, he was designing theatre buildings and directing theatrical performances at the royal court. Here's one of his designs, the Cockpit Theatre behind the King's Palace in Whitehall. You'll notice its polygonal shape. Jones's fascination with polygons is well known, which brings us back here to Chilham and the polygonal courtyard at the heart of this house. And there's this plan which for centuries has been put forward as the Inigo Jones design for the house, though mysteriously it is unsigned. Perhaps here we have an inkling of the origins of the persistent tradition which has been cherished here at Chilham for centuries, that Inigo Jones designed this house. After all, who wouldn't like to say that their family home was designed by the man who created palaces for the King and Queen? Perhaps it was. So the Jones tradition has lasted here, but the connection with Shakespeare has been more or less forgotten. Why? Well, 400 years ago, common playhouses and theatres were disreputable places. Respectable people had nothing to do with them. And 3 years after Sir Dudley died, they were all banned and closed down by Oliver Cromwell. The Inigo Jones connection, on the other hand, was a source of family pride. A gang of play actors mattered rather less. There we'll leave this realm of speculation and return to the here and now. In course of time, various buildings were erected alongside the kitchen wing on the left of the picture. But in the 19th century, the Hardy family, who acquired the building at that time, decided that they wanted more space. So they built this service wing instead, to contain all the extra accommodation that might be required for the servants of a rich gentleman at that time. There was a scullery, a bakehouse, a laundry, a room for the housemaids, and a separate room for the housekeeper, and so forth. In the 1920s, the end of the block was enlarged to house the swimming pool, replacing the housemaid's room and the laundry and wash house. Sir Edmund and Lady Davis managed with fewer servants than the Hardy family had done, and a local laundry took the washing. The addition of this service wing gave the house, of course, an entirely different shape. Viewed from above, it now has the shape of a spanner, whereas originally it looked rather like an angular letter C, as in C for Chilham.